I want to tell you now about one last event. I had met Amanda Sears. Amanda, I told you about Miss Lucretia, who was the daughter of Aaron Anthony, my master. She had a daughter named Amanda, whom I had grown up with. I was speaking in Philadelphia one day, and I looked over in the corner, and there I see a face that I recognize. It's Amanda, who has come from Baltimore all the way up to Philadelphia to hear me speak. And she and I established a lifelong friendship. When I went to Washington, D.C., I was made the U.S. Marshal to the district. And I decided that I wanted to go back and see the place that I had grown up. I think we all have that calling to go back to the place where you were born, no matter the tragedy of the circumstances of your birth. You want to go back home, like the salmon. And so I went back, and I was invited to come and talk to Thomas Auld, my old master. He was 82 years old, lying on his deathbed. And when I walked into the room, he raised up as best he could and stretched out his feeble hand. And he said, "Marshal Douglass." And I took his hand and said, "No, why don't we call me the name from old? Just call me Frederick." And tears welled up in his eyes. And we talked about the fact that he had manumitted all of his slaves when he had gone to a revival meeting and got religion. He had taken my old grandmother, who he had first set out on her own in a little cabin. He had brought her into his house and nursed her until she died. When I walked out of that room, I was curious in the thought that the Emancipation Proclamation had freed the slave, but there was no document to free the masters. Freedom rings, but I'm not sure if we found out how to make it ring for everybody. But then that's another story. I want to thank you for coming out and letting me speak to you this evening. You're very kind. You're very kind. I'm told that I can take a couple of minutes and take some questions from you, and I was told to ask you that if you're going to ask a question, would you please stand up? They have microphones pointing in your direction, but if you can stand up, then you can be heard. And so let us try to do that now. Right here, yes, please.
Can you tell us something about your relationship with John Brown?
Can I tell something about my relationship with John Brown? I certainly can. John Brown and I were good friends. I met John Brown in 1847. He was living in Elba, New York. Now, it's very interesting. Gerrit Smith was a great abolitionist, was a great landowner, and he's giving a lot of black people some land up in New York State, many acres. And he gave thousands of acres of land away. And John Brown came to him and said, "I would like to live among those black people and help to show them how to improve the land." And that was my meeting with John Brown the first time. And he came to my house several times and stayed for weeks. Became a very good friend of my little girl Annie. He'd regale her with all kinds of marvelous tales. He was a second man whose eyes you could look into and knew that he was a very determined and committed and honest person. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. Well, John Brown in 1857, during the Kansas mess, they had these border ruffians coming out of Missouri, which I told you already, with the Missouri Compromise had made Missouri a slave state. They're coming out of Missouri trying to make possess Kansas and makes Kansas a slave state. And so they're coming over, killing people, beating people up, and John Brown takes a group out there, and he gets involved in that whole mess. But what most people don't know is that he grabbed some people, some slaves over there, and freed them and brought them all the way across the country to my house. I passed them to Amy Post, and we sent them off on to freedom. And so this is the kind of relationship that John Brown and I had. When he said he was going to free somebody, he intended to do it. But in 1859, he intended to take over Harper's Ferry. And he came and asked me if I would join him. And he and I talked for a longest time. And I said, John, I don't believe that's a good idea. He believed it, and he went. He asked me to raise some money for him. And I raised a little bit, and a lot of other people did too, Garrett Smith being one of them. I walked away from that meeting thinking that I was a big coward. That here I had been a slave, and here's this man, never been a slave a day in his life, and he's going out to fight my battle. But then, just as I predicted, John Brown was hanged. And I had to go off to England to escape Governor Wise, who was looking for me and many others to do likewise. And when I was in England in 1860, and my little girl Annie died, and that's what brought me back here. But that was my relationship with John Brown. He was a good friend. Yes, here.
Could you talk a little bit about your family? Your wife?
The question was, can I talk a little bit about my family? No, not a little bit. I will try.